This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you could support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. A big thank you to all of our supporters so far. So it's just me and Patricia this week with a quick reaction to Jeremy Hunt's appointment as UK Chancellor. The conversation took place before the Chancellor's brief statement on Monday, and at that time it was already pretty apparent that he was going to reverse the tax cuts from the mini-budget. That was confirmed on Monday, along with the cancelling of the commitment to cap energy prices beyond April 2023, and it's all been delivered with a healthy dollop of not-so-subtle tough choices rhetoric, which always means cuts. And as I record this now, the media seem to have moved on to asking, can Liz Truss survive this? Whereas perhaps the rest of us are thinking, can we survive this? And as we grimly speculate about where the axe will fall, we can at least be thankful that the real victims of the last few weeks, markets, have been calmed just by the idea that there's an axeman in the building. And the government thinks that this, along with letting the Governor of the Bank of England use a random phrase generator to write his public statements, are the best ways to manage an economy. If you're new to MMT, you can listen to our first 3 episodes for an introduction. But if you want to dive in here, you'll probably be amazed to hear that it's an undisputed fact that the UK government can't run out of its own money because it's the source of its own money. It spends by changing reserve balances on a spreadsheet at the Bank of England using keystrokes. So why is there all this hysteria about the cost of government borrowing going up? Well, it's because the government, the monopoly issuer of its bonds, or gilts as they're called here in the UK, which can be thought of as interest-bearing pounds, the government has a choice. It can either just say what the price of a gilt is and enforce that price like the Japanese government does, or let a highly volatile hive mind tell the government what the price is. And our government's gone for that second option. And when the resulting price instability causes, in this case, private pension funds to dump gilts onto the market, gilt prices go down, which means their yields go up, and that's framed as the cost of government borrowing going up. But when you add in the insight that the government is the monopoly issuer of pounds, 2 things become apparent. Firstly, that the government doesn't need to issue bonds to fund its spending. And secondly, that government bonds, therefore, are just a basic income scheme for people who already have money. But before you get too outraged about that, there's actually a good reason for playing along with the myth that the government borrows its own money. Let me put it this way. Imagine if you went to the bank and you deposited £100 and then you asked the bank to lend you £100 and they gave you your own £100 back and also charged you interest, but you don't mind because you're actually the issuer of pounds. And maybe that's kind of weird, but nobody really notices, and you've actually got a few friends who work in the bank and it's nice that they've got jobs, so you just keep depositing and borrowing your own money. And it's fun until one day the bank decides to really jack up borrowing costs, which again isn't a problem for you, but you continuing to accept the bank's lending terms. Oh, you own the bank, by the way, but you continuing to accept the bank's terms is pushing up the price of credit for literally everybody else. And lots of those people now are starting to complain that they can't afford things like food and shelter. Now, if it was you, you might just stop with the whole depositing and borrowing game that wasn't really achieving anything except for giving some already well-paid people an even bigger free lunch. Or you might tell the bank manager, who's your employee at the end of the day, to stop making credit so f***ing expensive. But that would be because you're a zealous ideologue with no respect for central bank independence. Unfortunately for us, here in the UK, sanity has prevailed, and the spectre of fiscal dominance has been returned to its cage. I know a spectre can't really be held by a cage, but we had to sell off the national ghost containment system due to tough choices. So, volatility is the price of freedom, but don't worry, the government have promised to protect the most vulnerable pension funds by using their infinite currency issuing capacity to make liquidity available to those funds so that they can stop dumping gilts, further protecting those precious gilt prices. Phew, they'll probably help out people on benefits next. Anyway, Just before we dive in, a quick announcement that the second African Economic and Monetary Sovereignty Conference will be running from the 25th to the 28th of October, so very soon, and it can be attended online via Zoom. So I've linked to where you can find out more about that in our show notes, along with some other things that you might find helpful. And as ever, I've linked to where you can support this podcast financially via patreon.com/MMT podcast. Support starts at $1 a month or £1 a month or whatever the equivalent is wherever you live. And no matter what level of support you give, you get early access to all of our episodes and patron-only episodes. Your financial support really helps keep the show going, and your support in other ways, whether it's by recommending us to other people or just by listening and spreading the word about this stuff, really helps too. So thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive in. Welcome one and all to the MMT podcast. I'm Christian Riley.
And I'm Patricia Pino.
And as we record this, it's been another long week in politics and markets and economics. Liz Truss, it would seem, in an effort to save her economic agenda, sacked her chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, for having the audacity to implement her vision. And she's put Jeremy Hunt into the role, who's doing the rounds on the agenda-setting media, trying to reassure the electorate and perhaps the City of London that he's a safe pair of hands. But Patricia, what do you make of it all?
It's been interesting. I think that's the word I'm going to use. I think it would have been a lot more interesting if it was somebody else's country that this was happening to. Liz Truss, she's doing some things that you and I definitely do not agree with. But on the other hand, she's challenging the very dogma that I guess MMT challenges. And it's interesting to see how, commentators and mainstream economists and the main mainstream institutions are reacting to it, because I think that's very indicative of how they would react to potentially an MMT economist coming up with another set of policies that challenges, particularly the bond vigilante narrative.
I guess what we're talking about here is when we say her mini budget, Kwarteng's mini budget challenged the orthodoxy, we're saying it's so-called uncosted spending, basically,
exactly.
Like where a right-of-centre person would be like, yeah, these are radical tax cuts. We think letting people keep more of what they earn, that expands the private sector, diminishes the public sector. The private sector is where all the action happens. It's going to drive innovation, and this is why we think this is good. And we're not going to wait for the OBR to sort of tell us that we can afford it. We're just going to do it. The Office for Budgetary Responsibility, for anybody new here. It didn't work out like they planned.
I think you and I had a little bet at the beginning of all this, that you were wondering how audacious truly was Liz Truss and how much she was willing to stand her ground on this. And I was leaning on the side that she would eventually give in, but I wasn't entirely sure. And I think it's because she should have known the thing that she was challenging and the fact that people were not going to like it. And she sort of stopped short of the whole narrative. So she talked about growth, but of course that was then in opposition to what the Bank of England was trying to do, which is actually to slow down the economy. And people pointed out at the beginning, even during her campaign, that her aim seemed to be at odds with the Bank of England. And then she had a mini kind of criticism of the Bank of England about their approach to inflation, but it wasn't really anything, she could have gone all in. She could have gone and said, well, what the Bank of England is doing is not really helping, and I'm going to do it through the fiscal arm because that's what actually works. Instead, she didn't have the framework to justify what she was doing.
You are absolutely right. And she got told to sit down.
Yeah, she got told to sit down.
Somewhere. And now she's taking a seat.
Well, Kwasi got told to sit down.
Well, no, I mean, I think she was like, how about
scapegoat somebody?
Let's just change some personnel and see how much of the agenda we can keep. But you brought it up a minute ago. Bond vigilantes. Did bond vigilantes change government policy in your view?
No, they didn't. I don't think it was them that did it. There was this narrative going on that it was her policies, her expansionary fiscal policies were making borrowing more expensive and that the Bank of England had to intervene. But of course, the Bank of England can intervene, and it's indeed its job to intervene to calm the markets, I think. And it was really quite impressive the way that the Bank of England's mere announcement of intervention managed to bring gilts, long-term yields down. It became evident that it was what we discussed last week about the pension funds actually engaging in really risky kind of type of investments. So I see the government here, the government including the Bank of England as an arm of government, being truly sort of in control of the situation, to the extent that they're willing to threaten pension funds to get their act sorted out.
It seems to me the governor of the Bank of England, Andrew Bailey, didn't have to make the support is going to be ending, you guys have got 3 days to sort yourselves out announcement to the pension funds, because that was already the stated policy. It wasn't a change to policy.
Well, there was the expectation that he would extend it, I think. And he was basically just saying, no, I'm not going to extend it.
Let's just underline that the sell-offs, as you say, were causing gilt prices to go down. Those sell-offs were the result of pension funds dumping them to get liquidity. So what the Bank of England did was open another facility for pension funds to dip into instead of selling off gilts. And so the bank's price control mechanism, so to speak, was shifted to going direct to the primary cause of the gilt sell-off to tackle it there, presumably because that looks a little bit less like government intervention. It's a little bit more out of the spotlight than the Bank of England just going into the secondary market and buying bonds to push prices up. But the bottom line is the Bank of England got prices where they wanted them. So I think there was no need for the dramatic times up announcement. I'm thinking it might have been a tactic on behalf of Andrew Bailey, because it put more pressure on the leadership to either tell him to sit down, do his job, which is to make sure stability prevails, which the bank did anyway, right? Or say nothing, which they're inclined to do because they had so little political capital to play with anyway. So they have to make this play of respecting the so-called independence of the Bank of England. So Bailey's won that one. And that's now going to have a political chilling effect on any politician that wants to suggest using the power of a public purse to do anything progressive. Okay, look, it's good when a conservative is humbled into not pursuing their shrink the state agenda, but doing it this way, as in, the markets don't like it, so you can't do it. Well, that just means they're now going to shrink the state this way.
It's self-defeating. Yeah, it's self-defeating.
The markets don't like what you want to spend on, so the markets won't support borrowing for that level of NHS spending or that level of social spending. So unfortunately, we're going to have to make tough choices, which has already been, tough choices have been spoken about a lot since Jeremy Hunt has been doing the rounds in the media today. So here we are, exactly where we wanted you. Small state, precarious workforce, have fun.
Yeah, have fun resolving inflation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The senior editor at Bloomberg, Edward Harrison, wrote a short thread on Twitter. He wrote, "I take issue with the bond vigilante paradigm. What we see in the UK is really a question of inflation and the currency release valve. I'll explain. The currency is always the release valve, not rates. Japan shows us that. What happened in the UK is that the currency depreciated so rapidly, it led markets to speculate it would force an independent UK central bank to raise rates to prevent the cost of living crisis getting worse. The bond vigilantes aren't forcing anything. We saw that in the sovereign debt crisis with whatever it takes from Mario Draghi, and we see that with yield curve control. Central banks have an unlimited arsenal of reserves, which is our MMT perspective, right? The central bank neither has nor doesn't have any pounds. It just changes the scoreboard. It's the scorekeeper for the pounds, right? So as Edward Harrison writes, central banks have an unlimited arsenal of reserves to fight so-called bond vigilantes. So the UK stands in juxtaposition to Japan, where the Bank of Japan has made it clear it will maintain rates low. In the UK, rates have risen because bond markets are front-running likely UK central bank policy. They are predicting outcomes, not punishing policy. So forget about the bond vigilantes and think of them as bond policy frontrunners.
He's right in saying that the bond holders were simply reacting to what they thought the effect of policy was going to be. that acts in a way as a qualification on your government policy. It is basically symptomatic of what the likely outcome of your government policy might be. But in this case, that wasn't the problem, was it? Because if it was just an issue of nobody wants to buy long-term gilts anymore, or the price is going up, if that wasn't attached to something as important as the pension funds, if that wasn't attached to a culture of taking unnecessary risks and financialization and the liberation of finance, that would have been nowhere near as important as it was in this instance. So it talks as much about the institutional framework as it does about the opinions of the bond traders.
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to back all the way up here. See what you think about this. I think this sort of jittery market bond vigilante story kind of starts with global central banking. So we have a global pandemic, and then we've got Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and that disrupts supply of food and fuel and makes systemically important prices go up. And the response to that, because globally we haven't transcended monetarist orthodoxy, is to raise interest rates. The conventional wisdom is that makes it more expensive to borrow, so investment goes down, the economy slows down, that's going to lower the CPI. But obviously we know there's lots of holes in that theory. For starters, through the MMT lens, we're saying that actually because the government's a net payer of interest to the economy, those higher rates are leading to more interest income being paid from the government to the economy. And also by raising interest rates, you're raising another systemically important price, which is the price of credit, and that's feeding inflation. So with all that in play, inflation's going to keep coming. The hikes to supposedly fight inflation are going to keep coming and feeding inflation. Currency markets are seeing a higher return on dollars. They buy dollars, and that pushes up the dollars. So it's in this context that the mini budget sends financial markets into a place where pension funds are in trouble, causes the gilt sell-off and everything else.
There's a danger regarding investors as fully rational people who sort of know all things MMT and understand the full economy in an MMT way and react very rationally to what their best outcome, in which case, the summation of all their opinions on the outcome gives you the actual outcome, because that's how it works. But in reality, it's, some of them may understand MMT, have learned them, the truisms that MMT highlights through practice, but not all of them. And there are certain myths that do persist, the belief, for example, that QE may lead to inflation and all these things. And it's a very emotional process.
It's the lack of the MMT insight that's causing some of the behavior, in that, okay, so they'll go, QE is going to cause inflation. Well, what's the reaction function of a central bank? It raises rates. So traders act as if, rate hikes are coming. And when the Fed raises rates, the dollar gets stronger, right? I mean,
so what they're trying to predict is not so much, in my view, what is the true effect of the policy, as in how are other people going to react to the true effect of the policy? I think, it's like trying to guess how the market is going to react to something, regardless of whether that reaction is reasonable or not. And I think Keynes said something about that, about kind of the two-order of trying to guess what other people might be doing. But it creates a lot of instability, creates a lot of really massive swings in the market, and it can be very damaging if you're exposed to that risk, like the pension funds were. Then that's a real problem. But part of me goes, well, surely the pension funds should have known what the risks that they were taking. It's just, I guess they never really expected anybody to challenge orthodoxy.
So turning the corner, we're going to see a medium-term fiscal plan in 2 weeks' time. What do you think is going to be in that plan now? I imagine they're going to have to come up with some cuts, as I think Jeremy Hunt has said today.
We're going to end up with Rishi Sunak's plan, aren't we? I find it quite weird because at the moment, the way that the government seems to be trying to deal with inflation is by subsidizing consumption, effectively. So that's going to just go straight into the profits of big corporations. But then they're increasing as well corporate tax, aren't they?
Yeah, it was scheduled to go up from 19% to 25% under Rishi Sunak, remember, back in the day. And then Truss came in, and that was one of the first things Kwarteng said was like, we're going to abolish that rise. But anyway, they've U-turned on corporation tax. So corporation tax is going to be going up to 25%. Now, Patricia, two lefties like us, there's something a bit jarring about corporation tax rises when you look at them through the MMT lens. Would you mind easing us into that?
I think the main fear is that the corporation tax will just end up being added to the prices that consumers face. I would much rather an excess profit tax, like the windfall tax, but more aggressive, that would actually counter the kind of subsidies, whatever subsidies the governments were offering. I'm in two minds about whether we would definitely see it as just an add-on to what we're currently paying and therefore increase inflation in a sense.
Maybe 2 interviews ago with L. Randall Wray, I think the episode was called Are We Living in an MMT World? Because he had put out a paper. I think this was kind of shortly after, or maybe within the first 6 months of the Biden administration, saying, listen, it's our view that you should actually do away with corporation tax. So this is in the States. And obviously that sounds terribly right wing, right? Zero tax, right? And obviously, I'll quickly just add, they do suggest another way to go after the windfall that will be coming to people that will profit from that, like individuals that really don't need it. But you know, what he said was, because it's a cost of business and it's gone up. Now, is the corporation going to eat that cost? Well, we've seen from inflation that corporations don't do that. They pass it through. And in fact, they price gouge. So it looks likely to me that they do pass it through. And, you know, in a way, that's the only reason that I get animated about this, because if it was just, oh, well, rich people are going to have to pay more tax, which means they're going to be less rich, which is something that gets talked about in MMT circles. Oh, we're going to tax the billionaires out of existence, which never happens. I kind of don't like talking like that. I think we should be honest. I can quite easily see there are still billionaires. It's not working, guys. Right. And so taxes like this, the top end of town, as Bill Mitchell calls them, they've got too much power. They've got too much power to get loopholes written in and stuff like that. So I think it does get passed through, and then it hurts the people lower down. It's regressive when products get more expensive. So I think it's going to take more off people who really don't have much to give.
What you've just reminded me of, I think you're absolutely right, is that there is a tendency in people in economics in general, I don't mean any particular school, just in general, to make generalizations about certain predictions, you know, like lower interest rates increase house prices, or corporation tax will or will not be passed through. And it really depends. At the moment, corporations have a lot of power. The current inflationary episode is a demonstration of just how much power, and that there is a huge imbalance of power in the economy. And within that context,
I'll just jump in and say it's L. Randall Wray saying that I think he did some work with Bill Black a few years ago now, or he was citing Bill Black's work, which was looking at loopholes written into the tax code and tracing them all back to like, oh yeah, this billionaire bought that piece of legislation. You could see because it only applies to them, you know, and tracing loopholes back to the people that it must have been funded by. Basically.
But then the tendency is, you know, because we see these abuses, and the tendency is to try and limit sometimes the way that government wants to do certain things, and that sometimes requires generalizing rules, right? So saying, you know, this type of interest rate is bad, or this type of corporation tax is bad. And what I think is that it's very much dependent on its context, on the institutional context, on how much power corporations actually have. Even when we talk about the effect of interest rates and whether raising interest rates would be inflationary, the effect would be different in a country where you know, the central bank owns a lot of the bonds, that it would be in a country where it's actually the private sector owning the bonds, and the effect would be nil if nobody owned the bonds. You know? But it's really much dependent on institutional makeup, what the effect of a particular policy will be. And I think it's right to say, and I completely agree with you, that in the context where corporations at the moment have so much power over price setting, that any infringement over their profits will likely be either in a large proportion or all of it be passed on to the consumer. And we have to address that power. And we have to make it harder for them to set prices. But nobody's really talking about that.
But also, let's look at a smaller business person that's a corporation, because people can incorporate, right, that don't have price setting power. They're price takers. And their tax burden goes up via the corporation tax, and they're price takers and they can't pass it on. Well, that is coming out of their bottom line, but that's not Jeff Bezos.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I would prefer, the excess profits tax, because it is an establishment of saying we think that you deserve either 10% or whatever, 20% profit, and anything beyond that is an abuse of power, right? So you're not going to have it. That's the way I see it. So it's a way to discourage corporations to seek anything beyond that.
The context is important. All the institutional structure, how much political power the private sector has, the corporate sector has, and how they wield it. It all makes a difference to like whose wallet the corporation tax is going to hit. But I've got to say that it's definitely certain that, Bezos, Musk, these people, it's not going to touch their wealth at all, right?
Yeah, no.
Elon Musk is not going to put his hand up and go, oh, right, okay, so, corporation tax is going up. Don't worry, guys, I've got this. To just take it off me. They obviously mean me when they put the price. You know what I mean? The reason people set these complicated structures up is to avoid these kind of taxes.
In their view, it's only going to affect the suckers who actually pay corporation tax, right?
Yeah, exactly. So we're not going, oh, this corporation tax hike is bad because we love corporations. It's because we think that ordinary people will end up paying it. And obviously, ordinary people on lower incomes, it's going to be a bigger proportion of their income, and certainly not going to bring inflation down, I don't think. It's going to make things more expensive. What do we call that? I think it's inflation, right? And obviously behind all of this is the insight that the government is not pulling in tax money in order to spend it on the NHS and all this stuff that we love. Taxes function to control demand, the amount of spending power in the economy, in the private sector. Obviously, taxes are vital in order to give currency value. Taxes create demand for currency, as we said many, many times on this podcast. It's kind of like the central insight to MMT. And so, taxes are inevitable. And so it's about whose spending power are you limiting? And then you get to ask why. Okay, so what kind of an economy do we want, And so, with all that said, Patricia, I was going to ask you, we're progressive, we're lefties. I'm going to put you in number 11 Downing Street. What do we want? What should people like us want to hear? What would be a rational policy?
Having thought about it for the last 30 seconds.
I should have teed you up, sorry.
Yeah, I think this is going to sound harsh, but I think the prices going up, the energy prices going up isn't such a bad thing. Because I'll tell you a story. So, I've just moved into a house. I finally have a house. I was quite lucky that it happened before this whole inflation episode kind of exploded. But the fact that we were going to pay, the energy bills were going to go up so much did force us to consider things like insulating our home and making sure we had better windows and anything that we could do and start cost assessing absolutely everything that we could do to bring our energy bill down and do it as soon as possible so that we could take the most advantage of it and to sort of start having a plan of energy efficiency. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that that could have caused demand for technologies like photovoltaic panels and other things and insulation in general to come to homes, and are a huge source of energy consumption and CO2 emissions. So in environmental sense is a positive thing. That, however, you cannot have that at the expense of people who are generally, not having luxuries, just simply using energy for the basics of food and they're not using an exorbitant amount of energy. They're just, there has to be a minimum allowable energy, humane kind of allowance of energy for people to use in order to not risk dying in winter, for vulnerable people and all these things. So I would have focused all my effort on those people and maybe subsidized spending at the lower end of the scale, potentially at the expense of the big users. So maybe sort of have a scale of prices that companies are allowed to charge. For example, for the first, I don't know, however many kilowatt hours, it would be pretty cheap and then becomes more and more expensive the more energy you use. I think that would have been a way of rationing energy in a way that was a bit more humane, while at the same time, those people who are at the top end of the scale and who are paying the highest prices for energies also have an incentive to invest in green technology and to bring their CO2 emissions down. So you're sort of achieving two things at once.
I'm sympathetic to the point of view that fossil fuels should be expensive, because that sort of reflects how
the real costs, of energy. Yeah.
That reflects the externalities that they're creating. I get it, but there's something a bit off about it to me, just because it's like, it's not working. It's not working. It's not changing enough fast enough. It really is this kind of idea that, just let the market do what it wants, and the signals will pass everything through, and everybody will make the right stuff and stop making the wrong stuff. And it's like, that's just not happened.
I have a bit of faith in it, because as part of this process, we were looking at, for the first time at, okay, well, how much do photovoltaics actually cost? How much would that actually be? And whilst we were getting in touch with some companies to just figure out how much this would cost, a lot of them were telling us, oh, sorry, right now we are to the top of capacity and we can't even look at your house until 2023, until, the middle of the year of next year. And then that to me points to a problem of supply in these products. So there's no point raising the demand and hoping that demand is going to have an effect and positive effect in the market if you haven't ensured that the supply of these things are also kind of, there are no bottlenecks, and that it can actually has a capacity to respond to that demand.
It needs planning. Until people are willing to vote for somebody who says, I'm going to come in, our government is going to come in, and we are going to go full speed on renewables the moment you put us into office, and that becomes a vote winner. I don't know, the last time we had a progressive option was in 2019, and you couldn't even suggest free broadband without people going, well, you're just a magic Santa.
I think that brings us back to our original point, which is, I don't think we can do any of these things, any of this, investment in renewables, and actually stop looking at things from an individualistic manner and actually do something collectively to provide all of us with the energy we need in a sustainable way, without a fiscal arm that is willing to operate outside of what orthodoxy is at the moment, telling it that its boundaries are. So it brings us back to the point of, okay, the Tories are relying on fracking as a means of reducing energy bills. Is not the solution, but they do that because it's in line with their free market principles, and let's just keep extracting things from the earth and that will solve it. And it means that the government doesn't actually have to plan, organize anything. But if their fiscal expansion, and they've decided to then dedicate their fiscal expansion to tax cuts, and not very successfully, but that's what they wanted to do. If the plan was inverse, if the plan was to say, actually, let's carry out fiscal expansion, but for the purpose of developing these green technologies that everybody can benefit from, you're going to face this similar obstacles to what Liz Truss and Kwasi faced. And that's where I think it's useful to learn from that.
Yeah. But at least you could then point to when they go, well, where's the growth going to come from, or where are the efficiencies going to come from? And say, well, the economy is getting more efficient in this way, and that we're actually building this thing, and this is going to increase our productive capacity.
Right. Well, somebody who truly understood what they were doing would be able to justify it in 2 seconds, right?
Rather than just, we're going to let people keep more of their money by cutting taxes, and the market's going to figure out what to want because it's smarter than all of us, which is, it's an understandable thing that people to the right of centre posit. And it's like, well, so far so bad, actually. I know I do not wish to see gulags and things like that or anything, but it's not working. It needs something a bit more urgent.
And because they're not willing to move away from that, then they resort to, climate change denialism, and that's where we are right now. So what do you think is going to happen now then? Do you think we're going to have another general election soon?
My early, completely uninformed outsider take is that Liz Truss might not make it to Christmas, but I think it was Kurt Vonnegut that said history is a long list of surprises that can only prepare us to be surprised again.
It can change in an instant, can it? We really don't know.
I think the happy ending is that anytime we as an electorate want to decide to do things better and different, and not in a way that punishes vulnerable people, the money exists for that to happen. We need to choose it. There are solutions out there and we can afford them. And we've done episode after episode about why that is the case, and we will continue to do them. But obviously we come up against a culture that doesn't quite want these things yet.
How do we get society to grow? I think that's the question. And I think it's a mixture.
Well, I'm in the anti-growth coalition, so I can't really continue this conversation.
But grow spiritually. I think it's a mixture of a very fine balance between challenging preconceptions or your understanding of the world versus also showing a degree of empathy. And it's a really difficult balance to strike, and many leaders fail at it. And to grow, somebody has to make you uncomfortable, right, about what you believe at the moment. And the truth is, society at the moment believes in things that are very damaging to itself and to other and to minorities and to vulnerable people in general. And some may be more willing to learn than others, but this is way away from the realm of economics and inflation and all that.
But it's all connected, and like we say, anytime you want to choose different, it can be afforded. But we'll continue to unpack these issues and look at them through the MMT lens in the coming weeks. But for now, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on the MMT podcast. That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month, and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino. And you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.